Last week we started talking about the goat, the greatest of all time. I put a bunch of photos up and we started some discussion about, who was the goat here, who was the goat there. And, we put up sports people and artists and musicians and a few people got a little bit, some people were unsure, they didn't care. A couple of people had firm beliefs. Apparently the suggestion that there's any other goat apart from Taylor Swift got, at least one person here a bit fired up about things. Yeah, this guy here. But actually, when you talk about the greatest of all time, the goat, especially if you're talking to people of varying ages, there's one kind of sort of greatest of all time discussion that really gets people fired up, and that's when you start comparing like modern day greats with greats of the past. That sort of that kind of conversation. There's a cricket test match going on at the moment. If you start asking people, compare the modern batters of today against Don Bradman, people get really excited about, some people get really excited about that sort of conversation. Is Tiger Woods better than Ben Hogan? Is Ed Sheeran better than Frank Sinatra? Is Elon Musk better than Henry Ford? And there'll be people who passionately say, well, it was a different time and, it was better. But there's a thing about human nature. I don't know if you know this thing about human nature. We tend to think the things of the past are better than the things of the present. Did you know that about human nature? When you ask that, if you ask those questions, people will tend to lean toward people from previous generations, even sometimes hundreds of years ago, and say, today, the stuff today's never as good as the way it used to be. It's the way human sort of mind, the way human psychology works. We tend to love things the way that they used to be. Right, in all areas of life, but certainly when we think about those things that are really significant, those things that are kind of great and important, humans tend to look to generations gone by and say, well, it was better back then. There's something about the past, about the way things were, that sort of naturally attracts us. We're in part 2 of a series that we're calling Greater Than. And this series is all about digging into a 2,000-year-old message. A 2,000-year-old was like a sermon in the church that was preached in one of the very first churches, only 30 or 40 years after the resurrection of Jesus. And it was a message that was so powerful that the people who first heard this, it was so powerful to them that they copied it out and shared it with other churches. And those churches read it and kind of sat with it, and it was so powerful and significant to them that they copied it out and passed it on and so on and so on. And that one single message ended up being shared all over the world and actually ended up being shared from generation to generation to generation. The message became known simply as Hebrews because it was first shared with a church. We don't know exactly which one, but we know it was a church that was full of mostly Jewish or mostly Hebrew Christians. And so the letter, the message, the sermon just became known as Hebrews. And it's the book of Hebrews in our Bible. So that's what we've sort of been sitting with. And it's a pretty long message. And there's some really complicated stuff in it. But it has one simple main point. And the main point of this message is that Jesus is the greatest of all time, that Jesus is the GOAT. And so we thought since Christmas is coming and, it's that time of year when people think a little bit about Jesus and kind of the importance of Jesus in our world, we thought it'd be a good time to jump back into this ancient message and remind ourselves, ask ourselves about who is the real greatest of all time, the real GOAT. So if you've got a Bible, open it, find the book of Hebrews. We said last week there's Bibles at the back of the room if you want one. You can open it on a device, of course. We said last week that if you've got a paper Bible, Hebrews is easiest to find by starting from the back. The last book is Revelation. And from Revelation, then you have a couple of little books of John, a couple of little books of Peter, a book of James, and then Hebrews. So start from the back, find Hebrews. Last week we worked through the first 2 chapters of the book. The whole letter starts with the preacher giving a summary of where he was going. We read that, and then last week we read the first of the main sort of sub-points that the preacher makes, where he says that Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is greater than any of the sort of the angels and the spiritual beings. We said, in fact, the point he's making is that Jesus is greater actually than any other spiritual being or spiritual force or any kind of spirituality, religion that they were thinking about, that we're thinking about. Makes this point that Jesus is greater than all those things. So this week we're going to move on. So that was sort of Hebrews chapter 1 and 2. And we're going to move on to the next couple of chapters this week. We're going to do the same as we did last week. We're going to sort of skim through the chapters and have a look at what they say, and then come back and ask ourselves, well, what do we do with all of that in the 21st century? How do we take that ancient message and sort of make it land? You know, what are we supposed to do with it? I'll say the same thing that I said last week, which is that there are some pretty heavy, complicated ideas in what we're going to read today. And to be honest, it's really easy to read some of the text today and get a bit lost, get a bit confused in things. So I'm going to ask you, like I did last week, stick with me. We're going to try and sort of explain it as we go. But I think when we sort of circle back around and try and make sense of it in the 21st century, I think it might kind of land with you, at least at that point, and you're going to go, I get it, and it'll be good. So try sort of stick with us as we go. So if you've got Hebrews, let's go. We're going to start in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 1. I'm reading the New Living Translation, but anything works. Hebrews 3 verse 1. And so, dear brothers and sisters who belong to God and are partners with those called to heaven, think carefully about this Jesus. Think carefully about this Jesus whom we declare to be God's messenger and high priest. For he was faithful to God who appointed him, just as Moses served faithfully when he was entrusted with God's entire house. He starts off by saying, we need to think carefully about who Jesus is. And he makes this point, he says, if we think that Jesus is God's messenger, if we think that Jesus is a messenger, someone sent from God with a message from God, then let's compare Jesus with the greatest messenger who was ever sent from God, right? And if you are a Hebrew person, if you're an Israelite, if you're a Jewish person living 2,000 years ago, there's no doubt in your mind at all who's the greatest messenger that was ever sent from God, and that would be Moses. So when you compare them, the writer says in verse 2, Jesus was faithful to God just like Moses was. And in verse 3 he says, but Jesus deserves more glory than Moses, just as a person who builds the house deserves more glory, more praise than the house itself. So here's the second point of this big message. Last week he's saying Jesus is greater than the angels. His point this week is to say, and Jesus is greater than Moses. Just like the guy who builds the house is greater than the house because the one created the other, right? So his point is Jesus must be greater than Moses because Jesus was there when Moses created. If you were here last week, the writer made the point that Jesus was there at the creator of the whole world, so he's got to be greater than the whole world. He's making the same point about Moses, that, well, if Jesus was there when Moses was created, then Jesus has got to be greater than Moses, just like the builder of a house is greater than the house. Verse 5, he says, Moses was certainly a faithful servant in the house of God. Verse 6, but Christ is in charge of God's entire house, right? He's using his house analogy and saying, well, you know, Moses was pretty great, but Jesus is the boss of the whole house. And then he gives us a really important warning. I'll say this again, if you were here last week, when he preached about angels, the writer had this warning about angels. He said last week, if you listen to angels, and who wouldn't listen if an angel showed up to say something to you? If you're going to listen to an angel, then you better listen more to Jesus, because Jesus is greater than the angels. That was his warning last week. And this is actually going to be a pattern as we go through Hebrews, that each time the author makes a point, there's a warning that comes with that point, right? He's going to make a point and say, hey, and pay attention to this, because if you don't. And so as soon as he makes his point about Jesus being greater than Moses, in verse 7, he's got this important warnings. He says, so today, if you hear his voice, talking about Jesus. So today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts, as Israel did when they rebelled, when they tested me in the wilderness. He's talking about the way that God's people didn't listen to Moses. And by the way, Moses lived sort of 1,200 to 1,300 years before Jesus, right? So you think Jesus is old, but for the people who are first listening to their message, Moses is like ancient history to them. Does that make sense? So he's saying those people back in Moses' time, they didn't listen to Moses. Don't make the same mistake that people did in the past. Verse 12, he says, "Be careful then, dear brothers and sisters. Make sure that your hearts are not evil and unbelieving, turning away from the living God. You must warn each other every day, while it's still today, so that none of you will be deceived by sin and hardened against God." He's saying, don't turn away from God like the people did in the past in Moses' day. Warn each other, he says, while it's still today. In other words, like right now. Warn each other right now so that no one will make that same mistake again. If you jump to verse 17, he said, "Who made God angry for 40 years? Wasn't it the people who sinned, whose corpses, whose bodies lay in the wilderness? And to whom was God speaking when he took an oath that they would never enter his rest?" Now here's where it gets a bit complicated to us. Because here's where you really need to understand the story of Moses. And this gets complicated to us because we don't really understand and talk about the story of Moses much. But if you're a Hebrew person listening to this 2,000 years ago, they all knew the story of Moses, right? They knew the story of Moses like everyone today knows the basic story of Cinderella or something like that. Do you know what I mean? Moses' story was like that to them. Everyone knew the Moses story. But for us, who are here 2,000 years later, here's the 32nd version of Moses' story, right? Way back before Jesus, 1,300 years before Jesus, God's people, the entire nation, find themselves in slavery in Egypt. Whole other story about how they got there in the first place. But we're talking 1,000,000 plus people who are living in Egypt, but they're living as slaves. If you were a Hebrew person in Egypt, you were instantly a slave. And God chooses a guy called Moses, and he says, "I'm going to free the entire nation through you." Moses has a bunch of argument with God about that, but Moses ends up standing up to Pharaoh, who at that point is the most powerful man in the world, ends up standing up to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." It's kind of famous in the songs, if you know that line. "Let my people go. God says you've got to let us go." It's a whole thing that goes backwards and forwards between Moses, and God does all these incredible miracles through Moses. If you've ever seen any of the Moses stories, there's all the plagues and the weird stuff that happens. God does all these miracles through Moses, and eventually Pharaoh relents and says, "Okay, you can go." They leave Egypt, and on their way out they run into the Red Sea, which borders Egypt, and there's that whole thing where the waters part, and the people, if you've ever seen that in the movies, you know, they cross on the dry land. And when they get through the Red Sea on the other side, they're in a desert. And these people, we're talking like 1,000,000 people, are hiking through the desert on their way to what they believe is the promised land, right? This new homeland that God's going to give them. They're walking through the desert and they start to complain. "Hey Moses, this is a terrible idea. Whose idea was it that we left? I mean, when we were in Egypt, at least we were slaves, but we had beds to sleep in, and we had food to eat, and now you've dragged us out here and it's hot and it's dusty and we're tired and we got no place to stay and we're hungry and we're in a desert, there's no water and we're thirsty." It's kind of like every family car trip ever, right? It's like 1,000,000 people saying, "Moses, when will we get there," right? Are we there yet? And the point is that they're not really doubting and disobeying Moses, they're doubting and disobeying God. They're failing to trust that God is good to his word, and when he says, "I'm going to bring you into this land," that he's actually going to do it. And so God sort of punishes them by not taking them immediately to the promised land. And for 40 years, that million people wander around kind of in circles in the desert until virtually all of that first generation have got old and died. And they never got to enter the promised land. They never got to enter God's rest. And this idea of God's rest was a really important idea in the whole Moses story, and it's a really important idea to the guy writing this message. So important that as we get into chapter 4, he's going to spend the whole of chapter 4 unpacking this idea of God's rest. Chapter 4 verse 1 says, God's promise of entering his rest still stands. Now, it may feel like we're going a little off track because we were talking about Moses and now all of a sudden we're talking about entering God's rest. It's getting a bit confusing. We are getting a little bit off track. I'm going to ask you, stick with me because the guy who wrote this is really clever. It's going to get off track, but it's going to circle back around and we are going to end up back with Moses and eventually back with Jesus. But just hang with me. So, have you ever heard the Genesis 1 story of the creation of the world? Right? Have you ever heard that or read that? It's this image, this picture of God creating the world in 6 days. If you read that, God creates the world in 6 days. All these fantastic things happen. If you've read that, can anyone remember what happens on the seventh day? God creates the world in 6 days. You know what happens on the seventh day? On the seventh day it says God rested. On the seventh day, the Hebrew word for God rested is Shabbat, which is where we get the idea of Sabbath from, if you've ever heard that God's rest on the seventh day. And that idea of God's rest became a kind of vision for God's people of what perfect life with God should be like. And I want to say, when we're talking about God's rest, we translate it as God's rest. It's not rest as in I'm kicking up my feet and doing nothing in front of the TV, right? That's not what it means. The idea of rest here more means rest is a place of peace and contentment and joy and abundance in life. Does that make sense? I think the easiest way to describe it is you have those moments in life where you just go, things are just kind of good, right? That's what they understood this idea of God's rest to be, that God would create a world for his people where people could just go, I'm just in a good place. And the ancient people thought that the promised land that God was going to take them to was going to be that place of rest. They thought that God was going to take them to this place and the whole nation would settle down and live, and sort of a million people together could all go, here we are. But they disobeyed God and they failed to trust God and they never got there. And even when the next generation did get there, they never found that kind of rest in God. So fast forward from that point, 1,200 years, and the writer of Hebrews is saying, remember that promise? Remember that idea that God was going to lead his people into a place of rest? That promise is still true with God. He's still got that idea in the back of his mind. That promise still stands. Chapter 4, verse 2. For this good news, that God has prepared his rest, that's what he's saying, that's the good news, that God has prepared this rest, has been announced to us just as it was to them. But it did them no good because they didn't share the faith of those who listen to God. For only we who believe can enter his rest. Here's the point he's trying to make, is that God is still in the business of offering a life of rest and contentment and abundance and peace and joy. But it's not being offered through Moses. It's now being offered by someone who's even greater than Moses. I told you we'd circle back. It's now being offered by someone who's being even greater than Moses. He's saying we can now have this life of rest and peace and contentment and abundance and joy through Jesus. He's saying because Jesus is greater than Moses. So that beautiful idea of rest that was set up right in the very first page of the Bible that people have been hungering for and waiting for, and that we thought was going to come with Moses, and it never quite did. That promise still stands, and that promise is available to us now through Jesus, because Jesus is greater than Moses. Verse 7, he says, so today when you hear his voice, here's the warning again, do not harden your hearts. He's saying, so when you hear the offer of rest in this generation, because that's the offer that Jesus is making to them, don't make the same mistake that people did in the past. Don't harden your hearts like people did 1,000 years ago in Moses' day. And he finishes this part of the letter so saying, chapter 4, verse 11, so let's do our best to enter that rest. What are we supposed to do with all that? Let me try and summarise what the preacher's trying to say. He's saying for thousands of years before Jesus, and for us, for 2,000 years since Jesus, people have dreamed of a life of peace and contentment and abundance and joy. Right? We still dream of that kind of life today. We still dream, all humanity, all of us, we dream of a life of peace and contentment and abundance of joy. We still dream of that sort of kind of life. Right, where things just work, where you feel like you're sort of on top of life, where you're living without a feeling of stress and pressure and overwhelm. Instead, you're living with peace and abundance and joy and goodness. He's saying the Bible, the writers of the Bible call that kind of life rest. And 1,200 years before Jesus, everyone thought that Moses was going to lead them there. But the people didn't listen to Moses, they didn't follow him, and they died in the wilderness. And the preacher of Hebrews is trying to say to the people then, and I think if he were here today, he'd be trying to say to us, don't make the same mistake that they did back then. Don't look back to the past and say it was all better in the past. Open your eyes and see what's happening now. Jesus came with the ultimate promise to enter God's rest. And Jesus is greater than Moses. And he's offering you a life of peace and a life of contentment and a life of abundance and a life of joy. He's offering you a kind of rest that is greater than anything that Moses or anyone else since then could ever offer you, because Jesus is the greatest of all time. Do you get it? And I think if the writer were here today, he would say to us, this generation, don't get stuck in the wilderness again. Don't make the same mistake that generations before you have made. Because way back then, those people following Moses, they looked at what God was offering and they looked at the world around them and they said to themselves, you know what? I can do better. It's not that they didn't believe in God. They kind of believed in God, as in, I guess there's a God out there somewhere, but they weren't really listening to him, right? They weren't really following. They weren't really trusting him. And the writer's saying, in this generation, don't harden your hearts. Don't make the same mistake today, that God is still offering rest to people. That promise that he promised, it's still there. God's still offering people a life of peace and contentment and abundance of joy. Jesus called it life to the full. or abundant life, or life in excess in John chapter 10, verse 10. He's saying God's still offering that kind of life today through Jesus. Don't harden your hearts. I guess he's saying the opposite is actually to soften your hearts. To soften your hearts is a way of saying, just listen to what Jesus is saying. Follow him. Trust him. He said in chapter 4, verse 9, there's a special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest have rested from their labours. He's saying, friends, life doesn't have to be for us a labour. Right? It doesn't have to be a whole lot of hard work and striving and struggle and stress and anxiety. Life doesn't have to be that way. God is offering you rest. He's not saying that God's offering you a life where there's nothing hard that happens to you. That's not what he's saying. He's not offering you an easy life the way we think about easy life. What he's saying is that God's offering you a way to find peace and contentment and abundance and joy in the middle of whatever's happening to you. Get it? God didn't take them around the desert. They were still in the desert, but he said there was a life that you missed in the desert. There was a life of abundance and goodness from God that you missed in the desert because you took your eyes off God and stopped trusting God and started trusting yourself, and life got hard. It became a whole lot of hard labour. So let's do our best to enter that rest, the writer says. I told you last week that every week in this series is going to end up in the same place, right? I wasn't kidding. It does always end up in the same place. It's the writer saying, friends, we all want a good life. We all want a life that's full of peace and abundance and joy and goodness. And thousands of years ago, people thought Moses was the answer to that life, and he wasn't. And people have been searching for that kind of life ever since. And we're all still sort of searching for that life today. And there are people and there are brands and there are ideas that are telling us today, follow this, do this, believe this, buy this, live here, holiday here, and you'll have that life. If you'll just do this, life will be good. If you just do this, you'll get peace. If you just do this, you'll have abundance and joy. And this 2,000-year-old message, which is as relevant today as it was back then, says, friends, none of that really works, right? You know that? It might work for a little bit, but none of it really, truly works. None of it gives you that ultimate sense of, I'm where I'm supposed to be in life. This message is about saying that Jesus is the only doorway that leads to that kind of life. Jesus is the doorway to a life of peace and joy and abundance and contentment. Jesus is the doorway to a life that is full. Because Jesus is greater than Moses. Jesus has been able to do what Moses never could do. And you might not care about Moses, but the writer would say to us today, anyone else that you would want to stack up on the box that Moses was standing on, Jesus is greater than that person too, right? Whatever the idea is or the brand is or the holiday destination is or the thing that you want to buy that you think you can put on that box and is going to tell you this is the way to get the good life, none of it stacks up. Jesus is inviting you into a life of rest. And it's into a life that comes from him. He's inviting you into a life of peace and contentment and abundance and joy. I am deliberately continuing to use those words. That's the good news of Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, right? So I'm going to pray. We're going to worship a song. Some of us might be kind of an old song. It's a song that just simply says, I surrender all. Because that's what the people didn't do in the desert, right? They didn't surrender. They didn't follow and they didn't trust. And the writer's saying, don't make the same mistake. Don't harden your hearts and make the same mistake that people did way back then. There's a new and better offer being made for God's peace, and it's being made through the person of Jesus, because Jesus is the greatest of all time.